Hey guys, it's Miss Sheehan. So today I'm just going to do a lecture on the Korean War, which was the first violent conflict of the Cold War. So we're just going to go over that, and I would like you to take notes on this. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you. Okay, so the Korean War lasted from 1950 to 1953, and it was the first war that the US was involved in after World War II, and pretty quickly after World War II. So there were many soldiers who had fought in World War II and then fought in Korea as well. So, some background. In 1910, as part of their expansion efforts into Asia and China, Japan had actually annexed Korea. And as you can see from the map here, right, Japan, and then Korea's right there. And had suppressed its leadership and culture. And from Korea, they expanded into Manchuria and into China and out into the Pacific, as we talked about in World War II. And during World War II, Japan actually occupied Korea and kind of used it as a base to attack China and also to fight in other parts of the Pacific as well. And they did actually commit a lot of atrocities in Korea. So, not great. So after World War II, right, obviously Japan was defeated, and the agreement was to divide up the control of Korea between the Soviet Union and the United States. So if you remember, right, the Soviet Union actually, or Russia now, touches Korea right here. That's the border there with China, and then here it actually has a border with Russia or the Soviet Union. So it was supposed to be a temporary division of Korea at what was called the 38th parallel, which is latitude 38, right here. And the north was controlled by the Soviet Union, and the south was controlled by the US. So kind of similar to what had happened to Germany, where they divided it up into quadrants, right? So kind of the same thing here. And eventually the goal was supposed to be unification, where Korea would become one country again. So the major policy, as you read about in the Truman Doctrine last week, that America tried to enact during the Cold War was the policy of containment. And that was limiting or stopping the spread of communism. So by 1950, the Soviet Union was communist, obviously, but also China had just very recently become communist. So the US was very concerned that other countries in Asia would begin to fall to communism. And Korea, right, being right next to China and already being unstable from being occupied by the Japanese, was definitely a candidate to become communist. So it was the US's biggest foreign policy to basically stop by any means necessary any other country from becoming communist. So keep that in your mind as we talk about this. Remember, that's our goal during basically the whole Cold War, is to stop any other country from becoming communist. So North Korea, because it was controlled by the Soviet Union, becomes a communist nation. And the leader is a guy named Kim Il-sung, and there's a very nice, handsome portrait of him. And he becomes a dictator. So the Korean War, which was basically the war by the US and South Korea to take over North Korea, is what's called a proxy war. And that is where two other powers, in this case the US and the Soviet Union, use external conflict in Korea to attack the interests of each other. So basically the Soviet Union wanted Korea to become communist. The US wants Korea to become capitalist democratic, right? And they're not directly fighting each other. It wasn't like US soldiers were fighting Soviet soldiers, but we were using the soldiers of North and South Korea to basically try and take control of Korea away from each other. Right? So the North Korean side included the Soviet Union and China, who was the Soviet Union's major ally, now a communist nation. And obviously China would have an interest in North Korea, being as they share a border with it, right? And the South Korean side is the South Koreans, the United States, and also United Nations troops. So that's who's fighting each other. North Koreans, Soviet Union, and China versus South Koreans, United States, and United Nations troops. Often the Korean War is called America's Forgotten War because it kind of gets sandwiched in between World War II and then the Vietnam, which were both much bigger, longer conflicts. The Vietnam War lasted for 10 years. World War II, obviously huge, important conflict. Korea, in comparison, was not as large or as significant, but it did have a huge impact on the Cold War and on America itself. So, you can break the Korean War into 3 phases. So the first was the invasion of South Korea by the North Koreans, which is what you're seeing here on this map. And this starts in June 1950. North Korea and Chinese soldiers invade South Korea. And they are supported with weapons and financial aid from the Soviet Union. There are no Soviet soldiers fighting in Korea at this time. There are Chinese soldiers, but they are funded by North Korea, or by the Soviet Union. So the North Koreans and the Chinese managed to push the South Koreans and the UN troops all the way back to this little bit of South Korea here, surrounding the city called Pusan. Right, so actually the first phase of the Korean War was actually very effective for the North Koreans. They had actually managed to essentially invade all of South Korea. Second phase is in September of 1950, and then this is when the UN sends in a whole bunch more troops, including mostly American troops. And they are surrounded at this city in southern Korea called Pusan. Oops, sorry. And basically it falls to a stalemate here for a moment. And then we get to the counterattack, and this is the third phase. So this is after September 1950. General Douglas MacArthur, you might remember from World War II, was a very famous general. He had essentially taken over control of Japan after winning in the Pacific. Leads an amphibious invasion at this city called Incheon, which is north of Seoul, the capital of South Korea. And which they use as a landing point to push into North Korea, right? So they both push out from Pusan here and Incheon here into North Korea. And they actually, the UN and the US forces, managed to push North Korea all the way back to the Chinese border, which is the Yalu River up here. So actually it kind of goes the opposite way. North Korea invades first, pushes them all the way down to the end of southern Korea. South Korea and the US push back, push them all the way back up to the border. And basically at this point, China says, hey, don't invade us. If you do, we will declare war on the US. And that is a big deal. We do not want to fight China. We do not have the resources to start another major war. And we also know that if we do invade China, who else is going to back them up? The Soviet Union. And remember, neither us nor the Soviet Union really want to fight a major war between America and the Soviet Union right now, because we know it'll end up in essentially World War III. And also, we have nuclear weapons, right? So here's just some propaganda. So you can see here, this is supposed to be a MacArthur running from the Chinese soldiers. And more, so this is a Chinese propaganda poster showing a caricature of Douglas MacArthur committing atrocities as a US plane bombs a Chinese factory in the background. So this is basically trying to get Chinese support for the North Koreans. Okay, so then the fourth phase is the Chinese advance. So the Chinese actually start to push back from the Yalu River, the border with North Korea. And this is in the winter of 1950 to 1951. And China actually manages to push the US back to the south of the 38th parallel of that dividing line between North and South Korea. So essentially they end up back in the same position where they had started in 1950. So Douglas MacArthur at this point, who is a very famous general, he basically says we have to commit everything to this. We have to use all of the weapons in our arsenal to defeat the Chinese and to unify Korea. And he actually proposes using nuclear weapons, including not just bombs, but also what are called tactical nuclear weapons, like nuclear landmines or nuclear rocket-mounted grenades and things like that, to basically force the Chinese to leave Korea. And as you can imagine, back in the US, that doesn't go over super well. People are like, whoa, we don't know if we want to start a nuclear war. Korea it's not like Germany, right? They're probably not going to take over the rest of the world. So we don't know if we actually want to fight this kind of total World War II style war. And MacArthur says we should even attack China as well, and just go ahead and invade China and start a war with China. And people say, no, 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 pump the brakes. Nope. President Truman says, no, we're not going to attack China. And he actually relieves MacArthur of duty, which is military speak for being fired, which is a big deal because he was a general in the US military and he was fired for basically saying we should attack China and use nuclear weapons in Korea, right? And so MacArthur is fired and he is replaced by new generals who basically commit to a stalemate. So in 1951, it had ended up where the North Koreans and the Chinese had pushed the US and the UN back to the southern part of South Korea. And basically they started to talk about, well, let's just have a truce. There is fighting throughout the next 2 years through 1953, but nothing really happens, right? There's no big pushes back or forth, and it's pretty much a stalemate. So in June 1953, a ceasefire is called, which importantly is not an official end of the war. It's basically just like, we're not gonna fight you right now. We'll put down our weapons, and if you don't shoot us, we won't shoot you, kind of thing. And that's called in June 1953. So actually, technically, the Korean War has never officially ended. There's never been an actual peace treaty or an official end to the war. So it's still going on technically right now. And they establish along the 38th parallel right here, what's called the DMZ, which stands for Demilitarized Zone. And that's a chunk of territory that basically no one can go into that is supposed to kind of keep the peace between North and South Korea. And it's still there today. It's still very heavily guarded. You can actually go, if you go to South Korea, you can go and like stand on little balconies and see over into North Korea. And there's both South Korean and US troops stationed all along the DMZ border still today. And that was basically the dividing line between North and South Korea that still exists. So the effects of this war, definitely a lot of destruction in both North and South Korea that came after a lot of destruction that had been perpetrated by the Japanese during World War II. So they never really had a chance to recover after World War II before going right into this next war. About 3.5 million Koreans died or were injured during the war, which is a huge number of casualties for a fairly small country at the time. 54,000 American troops died, which again is a large number, especially as we had just had 400,000 Americans die in World War II. And North Korea becomes totally isolationist. They cut themselves off from South Korea. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, who had been providing them aid, they basically cut themselves off from the rest of the world. China still does provide them financial aid and stuff like that, but not really on any large scale. So for the last 50 years or so, North Korea has been kind of a country that doesn't interact with any other countries. And South Korea develops strong ties to the US, and they actually develop a very strong capitalist democracy, and they have a very, very strong and important relationship with the United States as well. So if you do join the military, one of the places you will probably go if you are deployed is to South Korea, because we have many, many US bases in South Korea. And really the hope for a unified Korea after World War II dies. That had been the dream for a long time after the Japanese had left, that Korea would become one unified country again, like it had been. And that was really gone after the armistice, because they knew that North Korea wouldn't give up if South Korea didn't want to become communist. And South Korea basically said, if you remain communist, we're not going to join with you. And so every so often there's like talks where they're like, well, we should have a peace and we should, or like open up the border or get rid of the DMZ again. And they've, for the last 60 years, they've just failed every time. So every so often people try and like start those peace talks again and they just collapse again and again. So the significance of this war include a very strong commitment by the US to containment. This is a signal that we are willing to go to war and to expend military capital, life capital, financial capital to stopping the spread of communism. Basically, this is America saying, we'll do whatever it takes. We don't want any more countries to become communist. This is also what's called a limited war, in which this is really the first time that we had not used all of our available weapons in a war. We did not use nuclear weapons in Korea. And in fact, that was a line that a lot of public and people in the government said, no, we're not going to cross that. Right? We did it in World War II. We used nuclear weapons on Japan, but this was the first time that really we said, no, there is a line we're not going to cross. And that was the use of nuclear weapons, even though that probably would have won the war for us. And the other significance was that total victory was really impossible. We did not effectively contain communism. North Korea was and is communist now, and we basically had to commit to a stalemate. And technically, the war isn't over. As I said, no peace was ever signed. There was a meeting recently in April of 2008 where basically the dictator and the South Korean government said they're going to work towards peace, but no progress has really been made on that. So today, North and South Korea are very different. So this is a satellite image here of, you can see all the electric lights in South Korea, especially in Seoul, the capital, very heavily industrialized, a very modern country. And you can see in North Korea, there's almost no electricity. So North Korea is one of the poorest countries on earth. Really, their only major city is Pyongyang, here, the capital. And most of the country is basically very rural. We don't know a ton about North Korea, but we do know that the conditions there are very bad. There's a lot of famine, there's a lot of hunger, it's totalitarian, it's really not a good place to live. And you can see the line here, that's the DMZ there, that line. Right? So the DMZ, the Demilitarized Zone, as I said, is still there today. And actually a few years ago, it was discovered that North Korea had actually tunneled under the DMZ and built these tunnels where it was possible that they could attack South Korea through these tunnels, right? But now, South Korea actually blocked them off, and you can go walk in these tunnels under the DMZ. And you can also go to the DMZ and like kind of look across it. So this is a DMZ crossing point. So these are North Korean guards, and that little concrete curb there, that's the barrier between South Korea and North Korea. So literally you can step across it and go across that border, but you're really not like, they get very mad at you. You will get shot if you do that. Right. So they have these guards where like these are South Korean, and also they have US military guards who literally just stand there all day and stare into North Korea, and that's the North Korean building. And they have the same thing you can see up here, the North Korean guards standing there and staring into South Korea. And actually in the US military and the South Koreans who are stationed there, they deliberately choose the biggest, most imposing guys to stand there to like show that they're like bigger and more masculine and scarier. So you have to be like a certain height to serve at the border there. And occasionally the leader, Kim Jong-un, will come out here and like look over with binoculars into South Korea. We have a Korean War Memorial. It's right next to the Vietnam War Memorial and the World War II Memorial in Washington, D.C. And it is of these soldiers memorializing the horror and atrocity they faced in the war. North Korea today, one of the most cut off countries in the world. They actually got nuclear weapons in 2006, and they are one of the countries that we are most worried about them actually using nuclear weapons on people, on like another country. And so that's kind of like a continuing fear that North Korea will attack, especially the US, with nuclear weapons. Their leader for a long time had been that guy, Kim Jong-il, and he died in 2011 of a heart attack. And his son, Kim Jong-un, that guy was declared the new leader, and he has been leader of North Korea since then. So essentially at this point, they're a hereditary dictatorship, and it's probable that Kim Jong-un will have children and his children will become the next dictator of Korea after he dies, unless something happens, right? And he actually had Kim Jong-un had his brother attempted to be assassinated in an airport a few years ago. So there's a lot of like political intrigue around that. Yeah. So I would just like you to answer this question there at the end of your notes. Should the US have fought in the Korean War? Consider whether you think the US should be generally interventionist or generally isolationist, and then use the events or results of the war to support your answer. Okay, so once you have done that, we're good for today. I'll talk to you guys later. Leave me a comment or ask me a question in Teams if you have anything you need me to respond to. Hope you guys are staying safe. Bye.